When you hear the name Peter Jackson, most people will instantly think of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but many, mainly those who aren't cinephiles, don't know that Peter Jackson came from humble beginnings, climbing himself all the way to the top free solo. One does not simply become one of the best film directors in history. Here's the making of Peter Jackson and how this filmmaker became so rich. Let's start from the beginning. Peter Jackson's early life. Peter Jackson was born in Wellington, New Zealand, in the far north suburb of Pakera Bay on October 31st, 1961. He was raised by two hardworking parents. Joan, his mother, was a housewife and a factory worker. His father, William Bill Jackson, was a wages clerk. Both had moved to New Zealand from England, where Peter would grow up watching Monty Python, Thunderbirds, and Ray Harryhausen films. When Peter was 8, a friend gifted the family a Super 8 Cine camera, thinking that Peter would enjoy it the most, and soon after, Peter would start making films and experimenting on his own. King Kong is a known favorite of Peter, which he attempted to adapt on his own when he was about 9. He tried using stop motion in everything, making his own models. Peter also made an epic about World War II called The Dwarf Patrol, which can actually be found on the Bad Taste bonus disc. The movie featured the filmmaker's first tries at special effects, poking pinholes in the film to represent gunshots. Even more impressive is the fact that Peter won himself a special prize for the shots he used in a 20-minute short called The Valley. Peter never had any formal training. He was just experimenting, allowing himself to fail, learn, and try again. In high school, Peter discovered Tolkien, and he dropped out at 16. He worked as a photo engraver for the Evening Post for 7 years, saving up to become a director. Next up, Peter Jackson's splatter phase. When watching some of Peter Jackson's earlier work, it's a little hard to believe the work comes from the same person. Bad Taste, Peter's first real project, is a sci-fi comedy horror with suit-wearing aliens that attack a small village in New Zealand in order to farm humans for a food franchise in space. He featured in it himself, used absurd costumes to bring the aliens alive, and was filled with equally absurd violence, crude jokes, and budget special effects. Peter worked on Bad Taste on the weekends and any of his spare moments. Peter worked tirelessly on the movie for years, and much of the project, mainly the acting, was done for free. Peter received a last-minute financial boost of $5,000 from the Film Commission to finish Bad Taste, which was shot entirely in New Zealand, by the way. Peter ended up submitting the movie to the Cannes Film Festival in 1989, but though he didn't win, it gave Peter that first push into the industry that would end up making his entire career. Bad Taste wasn't as good as the work that we've come to expect from Jackson, but it showcased the incredible talent hidden in him and showed he had the perseverance needed to make the huge projects we all know and love Peter for. Bad Taste has everything that the Lord of Rings has: comedy, action, fantasy, romance, and that special something, a lot of love for the craft. Following Heavenly Creatures and Forgotten Silver, it was obvious from a very early stage that Peter Jackson was not afraid to experiment and maybe even make a few mistakes here and there. But just as important as allowing yourself to make mistakes sometimes, it's important to know when to listen to advice. Peter says that the only reason Heavenly Creatures was made was because of the enthusiasm Fran Walsh, whom he married in 1987, had for the project. She believed there was meat enough to flesh out a worthwhile movie, and she was right. Heavenly Creatures is based on the rather infamous Parker Holm murder that happened in Christchurch in 1954, and it showed Peter's ability to present a more serious type of storytelling, just as good as everything else. The success of Heavenly Creatures coincided with the media tracking down the real-life Juliette Holm, who writes books under the pen name Anne Perry these days. The movie released in 1994 and was critically acclaimed, and was even nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Script. But Heavenly Creatures didn't just put Peter Jackson in the spotlight, it highlighted the hidden talents in New Zealand, a place that had been generally unknown to the film industry. And then Peter Jackson knocked on the door. Next up, we're getting into Forgotten Silver, the mockumentary that maybe could have used a warning of some kind, because it made a lot of people very upset. Also, we'll finally get to the Lord of the Rings and close off with a bang, because Peter Jackson isn't just a success anymore, he's officially a member of the Billionaires Club. Let's get back to it. First up, Forgotten Silver. When Forgotten Silver was first aired in 1995, it seemed an awful lot like it was a serious documentary about the entrepreneurial New Zealand filmmaker Colin Mackenzie. In reality, it had all come from the powerful mind of Peter Jackson. Peter had made it seem like Mackenzie was the true innovator of many cinematic techniques, even calling him the father of modern cinema. Peter also used real actors and film historians like Sam Neill, all to prove his claim. Peter claimed that Mackenzie was the person who had invented color film and talkies. Supposedly, Mackenzie had attempted to make an epic film of Salome, but as he was forgotten by the world, it seems like he did not succeed in this imaginary timeline of Peter Jackson's. But despite the fact that the mockumentary aired in a slot that was normally reserved for drama, there was no warning or notification whatsoever to inform the viewer of its fabricated nature. A lot of people got very upset when they found out there was never such person as Colin Mackenzie, and he certainly didn't invent color television. But it just goes to show how incredibly talented Peter is, with the focus and determination to make whatever he puts his mind to the best as he can make it. Next up, Lord of the Rings. There are, of course, lots more projects that Peter Jackson put his mind to through the years, but there is one project that shot Peter into fame that little Peter never dared dream about even existed. Heavenly Creatures ultimately paved Peter's road to his first big-budget movie, The Frighteners, but it completely flopped. Nonetheless, Peter moved on and actually won himself the rights to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings in 1997, after a meeting with producer Saul Zaentz. And we all know what happened next. The trilogy was a wild success from the moment The Fellowship of the Ring was released in 2002, and The Return of the King even won all 11 Oscars it was nominated for. It was the first fantasy film ever to win the award for Best Picture, and it was the second sequel to win Best Picture, after The Godfather 2. The success of Lord of the Rings solidified everything that had always been present in Peter's work, and earned him a definitive spot between the A-listers of Hollywood. Of course, there were some more flops after Lord of the Rings. Mortal Engines, which came out in 2018, was received pretty badly, for example. But if there's one thing to be learned from Peter, it's that it doesn't matter, because his latest release, The Beatles Get Back, sees Peter right back on top of his game again. And that leaves us with where Peter Jackson is at right now. As of 2022, Peter Jackson has officially joined the Billionaires Club, according to Forbes. Peter has been successful for many decades now, but before he joined the Billionaires Club, he was worth an estimated $700 million, which is nothing to be ashamed of either. But what has pushed the filmmaker over that limit, and then some, was the sale of the 3D tools division of Weta Studios. Peter co-founded Weta in 1993 in order to produce the digital effects for his movie Heavenly Creatures, and together with his wife, Fran Walsh, he still owned a 60% stake in the company. Maybe you recognize the company for numerous huge projects over the years, which include the legendary Game of Thrones, James Cameron's Avatar, and obviously The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. Peter was able to cash out with his wife when they sold to Unity Software for a rumored $1.6 billion. Peter walked away with a reported $600 million and another $375 million in stock, which means Peter really has nothing to worry about for the rest of his life, and he can continue to experiment with film, the only thing he ever wanted to do. And that was all we had for now. What do you think about Peter Jackson's rise to fame? Was it his hard work or a lot of luck? Maybe some credit should be given for Peter's great perseverance, but what seems most obvious with Peter is one thing: he is absolutely in love with his job, and that can make up for a lot of things. Let us know in the comments what you think of Peter's journey, and thanks for watching.